All right, in this third installment of the graphic design history unit, we're going to talk about modern design up into the current digital age. And we're going to go through just some more art movements and just see how things have transitioned over the years. So we're going to start at the information age. And we're going to talk a little bit about one more design style that was in Europe called the Swiss style. So this was kind of 1930s, 1940s, a little bit there. But the Swiss style, which is still referenced today because of the way it was set up, it's very focused on layouts of geometric elements organized with absolute order. So they were really big on grids, using modules in the grids, using the golden spiral or the golden ratio, very mathematical proportions, very geometric spatial divisions. So there's a lot of order, a lot of structure to it. And they did not break that order or structure. Everything had to fit into it. The text, the images, even if you look deeply at some of the Swiss design, even when they would set up a photo shoot and they would arrange the people in the design, they had to be arranged in different heights and different depths and different places so that they would fit within this very strict mathematical grid. So one of the new typefaces that came of that was Helvetica, which is still used today. It's a sans serif font that's very bold, it's very strong, and it's very mathematical and kind of fits into that Swiss style quite a bit. Joseph Mueller Brockmann is a very famous Swiss style graphic designer. And again, he wanted absolute and universal graphic expression without any feeling. So he didn't want the designer to say, oh, but this kind of feels right, or I want to evoke this feeling. He said, leave that out. We want perfect geometric layout and perfect mathematical proportions. That's what the Swiss style was all about. So anything created in that Swiss style had that same very proportional mathematic grid layouts to them. And yes, we still use those kind of concepts today, but we do have a little bit of freedom with it. So grids are important. We'll learn about that later in this semester when we get into InDesign, how they work. And they are very helpful, but we don't want to be like living by them so rigidly that it kind of stifles our creativity a little bit. So then we move into America a little bit and we go to the New York School of Graphic Design. So the early immigrants in the 1940s were influenced from some of these European graphic design, but they took a huge step towards making it more original. And one of the things the ways they did that was it was very pragmatic, it was intuitive, and it was an informal design. So like the Bauhaus movement in the Swiss style, where there was like a template and like a theory behind it, and it's like you did everything within those guardrails of that theory. In the American style, this New York school, they didn't have a set theory. It was like, what felt really good in this moment? How does this look? How does this feel? What do we want to communicate? And they let that drive their design. They may have pulled things from the Swiss style, like maybe they used a grid, but they were willing to break the grid if it meant better communicating the emotion and feeling behind the design. Paul Rand and Saul Bass, who we'll look at a little bit later as well too, were two key members of this New York School movement and some of the graphic designs that they created. And also one thing to know is like in America, because we're such a highly competitive consumer society, they really took pride in and coveted novelty and originality. So this idea of, like I said, with Swiss style and Bauhaus, it had to fit in this formula a little bit. So there wasn't as much creativity and novelty with it. They can only go so far within this box. But in America, it was all about how creative and new can you be. And so the more creative, the more new that you were, the better. And that's what we start to see in these later movements, is how far these designers and even artists and pop art movement and things like that really push the concept of what is creative art and what is design. Even in advertising, we start to see that kind of pushed a little bit. The Doyle Dan Bernbach ad agency in New York in the 1950s and 60s created some really cool designs that separated verbal and visual communications, but the word and images were fused into a conceptual expression. So, for example, this Volkswagen one, you get the word think small. And so they fuse that into a visual conceptual expression by making the car kind of off in the distance really small and a lot of this white space. So that empty white space there also helps reinforce that it's kind of smaller off in the distance. There's all this extra space around it. But if you were to draw a grid, like a rule of thirds grid on that square, you would see that that car falls on the grid. So there's an element of that Swiss style of using a grid, but breaking that grid a little bit in terms of bringing in the conceptual expression with it. And then you got this advertisement here from Levy's Jewish rye bread. So again, it's called a Jewish rye bread. So it was kind of marketed towards the Jewish community, but they wanted to reach out to other people and say, this isn't just for the Jewish community, this is for anybody and everybody. So we want to communicate that this is for any person who wants this. So a lot of their ads, it says you don't have to be Jewish to love Levi's. And they would have all these different photos of people of different races and cultures and ethnicities and show them eating the bread to be like, hey, anyone can enjoy this. This is for anybody and everybody. So again, you're getting into the emotion behind it a little bit too, and the concept behind it, and not just this rigid structure of it has to fit this mathematical thing or this visual concept. So the design in America really started to kind of become something unique all its own. And even kind of took a further drive in terms of expressing their design through typography. So typographic expressionism is letter forms becoming objects, and objects became letter forms. So for example, here you've got the word tonnage. The word tonnage is referring to the weight of something. How many tons does it weigh? And you feel the weight of that word because of the way the text underneath it is being crushed and moved and flexed. So the word actually visually communicates its meaning by crushing the words below it. It's a really cool concept and a really great visual idea there. And the same is true of the one next to it. She's got to go out. The two O's represent the wheels on the bike. So bringing the visual objects and combining it with the text and making the text part of the design objects is a really new concept. They did a lot of typography that was decorative and was part of the design, but not to this level. And so what we're going to do actually is do a small mini project based on this kind of concept of typographic expressionism. And one of the things that came from that was something called concrete poetry. And so in our assignment, you are going to create a concrete poetry design using one of the words on the right. So I've got this 2 columns here of these words, a lot of words. And if you have another word that's not on this list that you want to use for this assignment, awesome, you can go for it. You're going to use 8x10 paper, which is a piece of copy paper. So if you have printer paper or copy paper at home, you can use that. If you have a piece of construction paper you want to use, any color, you can totally do that. Or if all you've got is some lined paper from your notebook, then just go ahead and use that. And I'll give you some examples of what it's going to look like in a moment here. So the one thing you need to keep in mind, the design must visually communicate the word. So if you think back to that word tonnage we saw, right? That word, the type was really thick and heavy, and it looked like one giant big block, right? If I were to write the word tonnage with really thin words or maybe like a cursive writing, it would not communicate the same thing. So it had to be very big, thick, blocky letters for it to feel like it was heavy, because there's a lot of that black ink that was on there. And then using the letters below it, kind of bent like it was falling on it, gave it the sense of weight. So that's what I mean by it says design must visually communicate the word. Okay. This artist here, Julia May Apollonari, I think I pronounced that right. But if you want to look at him, he did a lot of concrete poetry work and give you some inspiration as well beyond the examples that I'm going to show you. So you might come back to this in a moment and look at this list, but you're going to create a black and white composition. It says 10 minutes, but don't worry about that. Just ignore that. So let's look at some examples. And this is what we're going for. So let's look at the upper left one. It says stairway. And you can see what they do is they take one letter away from the word until you get to just the S at the very top. But if you look at how they're stacked up, it looks like a set of stairs that goes all the way to the top. So stairway, and then the words are arranged so it looks like stairs. That is how you visually communicate the meaning of the word through the word itself. Another example here is this one explode, right? So the O is exploding, it's disappearing, and then there's all these little particles around that. One thing I would have done differently with this one is whatever the actual shape of that letter O, I would have repeated that letter O a bunch of times in those little dots as opposed to just making perfect circles. I think would have tied that in a little bit better. But you get the concept of the word, explode, it blows up, everything goes everywhere. So from the O, all these things come out of it. Void is another great example. I love negative space. When it's used really well, it can be so effective. So the O is missing, so to speak, and then the little sliver inside the O is filled in black. So that way, visually, your eye always wants to fill in empty spaces. So even though there's nothing there except that little line, you don't see VIID. you see that, oh, your eye wants to fill that in because of that negative space there. But void means empty, right? It's a void, it's an empty space, it's blank there. So you take that O out, reverse it, and it looks like an empty space or a void. So really clever there. Fold, another example there, like the O and the D are kind of cut off, or it looks like they're folded over each other. And the reason that works is because if you literally fold it in half, they would disappear. If I tried to do that with the L and fold that in half, you'd see it would look like a real blocky C or look like a blocky U. It wouldn't work. So that had to work with just those two letters, because if you fold them in half, they will actually kind of disappear, so to speak. This next one right next below that is pollen. So have you ever seen those weeds where they're like the little white puffy ball and you blow on it and just kind of the little pollen pieces fly away? That's what they created there. So they wrote the word pollen in like a repeating spiral, and then all of a sudden the word kind of drifts away. The letters, I'm sorry, drift away a little bit like they're being blown off like pollen. So great concept there. Dialogue. So this one's a really cool one. You've got these dialogue balloons to make this lowercase letter G, and then and it spells the word dialogue. The reason this works so well the way it is because the D and the A and the O, those shapes are perfect circles, and they mimic the shape of those communication bubbles. If I would have used like the letters from void in the words D, or in the letters DIALO, they would have been too blocky and thick, and it would not have looked right with those two communication bubbles. So when you're doing those things, think about that as how does all of it tie together? So if I'm going to do that kind of concept, or if I have something that's got some really nice clean circles, I need to incorporate that into the rest of the word so that it all fits together well. And then the last one there is the word delete. I'm sure all of you saw the word delete right away, even though the L was missing. Again, it's this concept that our brain likes to fill in the gaps. Even when a letter is missing, it will fill in the gaps and recall the word closest to it that we think it is. And in this case, it's the word delete, but the L is been deleted. So that is what you guys are going to create. Let me go back a page here to show you again. There's that list. So go ahead and pause the video here. Spend some time being creative, just explore some things, and just have fun with it. And when you're done, you're going to create a full page one. Remember, 8 by 10 paper. Use a Sharpie marker, or if you want to use pencil first to sketch it out, and then go over in Sharpie marker or something like that to color it in. If you want to choose a different color to maybe help emphasize your meaning, that's awesome. You can do that as well too. Don't get too colorful with it though. You can only use one color, because we don't want the color to communicate it. We want the word and the design to communicate the meaning. Okay, so one color on a sheet of paper. Okay. And so when you're done with that, like I said, take a picture of that, and then you're going to upload it to the Padlet. There'll be a Padlet there that says Concrete Poetry Padlet, and you're going to upload it onto the wall and be able to see everyone else's work. So go ahead and pause the video here and enjoy some creative time. All right, coming back to this, we're going to talk a little bit about corporate identity. So we mentioned earlier, Paul Rand and Saul Bass were two artists during that New York School movement. And what we start to see is corporations want to be recognized. We start to see this idea of branding. So we want to have better communication to the consumers. We want to be more recognizable to the consumers. We want our name out there. We want it to be everywhere. So corporate identity became a huge thing, and logos were a big part of that. Paul Rand was an art director for Esquire magazine, which, if you think about it, magazines are a really huge compilation of creative people coming together to create a creative document. It's, the photo on the front taken by the photographer, using the graphic designer to do layout and text for the information on the cover, organizing and doing layout of articles with images, with graphics, with all kinds of stuff put together. And the layout and the spread of an article is very intentional in how it's done. So those are all things that he was a part of. He was the director of that, of a lot of designers helping to put that together. He also was a part of being a brand identifier in his logos. So he did logos for Enron, which I don't know if they're around anymore or not, but they were there in the 90s. Next, if you're not familiar with Next, this was Steve Jobs, the creator of Apple. When he was fired from Apple, he created Next to try to compete against Apple. It did not go very well, but he was rehired by Apple soon after that. But that is their logo that they created. And then IBM, which still uses this logo today, that was created by Paul Rand. And then UPS, the logo that you see on the truck today, is what he created. And then the ABC logo as well. Saul Bass was another guy. He also created logos, which you can see on the bottom there, the Bell telephone logo in the upper left, still used today, right? The AT&T logo next to that. I'm not sure what that little green one is. Can't remember. Then there's Minolta, which is a camera company, and then the Girl Scouts logo, still used today. Some of these you might recognize, right? Kleenex, Quaker Oats, the Dixie Cup, that symbol is still used today. The United Way symbol, the hand with the little boy in the rainbow there, or the person in the rainbow, I should say. All of those are recognizable and still used today, just like some of Paul Rand's logos. We'll learn this later in the year when we do some logo design, but a great logo is simple and timeless. So these have been around since the 50s. They have changed very little, if at all. The only one I can see on here that's changed quite a bit would be the AT&T logo. But if you look at it, it hasn't changed in its concept. It's just the look of it. So it's maybe been more three-dimensional and all that. But I think now they're even back to the original flat design. So very little has changed of it. But I think they just kind of update it or refresh it a little bit. But for the most part, these logos are still in use and used today. But just like Paul Rand was an art director for a magazine, Saul Bass was also a designer in other areas. He did movie posters and title sequences. So you can see there's a couple examples of his movie posters that he created. And a title sequence, there used to be a time when in the beginning of movies, there would be this 3-minute time of like they would use the credits and who's the main actor and who's the director and what's their role in it. And it was a very intentionally designed part of the film. It was this sequence of titles of people and the movie and all that would be going on, not just at the end. So if you watch any of these original movies like Hitchcock's Vertigo or The Shining, and you watch the first few minutes of it, those title sequences were designed by Saul Bass. So he was a really big part of that and very well known for that. And then we get into postmodern design. Now we're getting into the 70s. And if you know about anything about the 70s, it was a very rebellious decade, right? A lot of people were coming out, the hippie generation. They were kind of fighting against the government, fighting against the Vietnam War. And so we saw that reflected in design. Remember earlier we talked about with American design, it was all about they coveted expression and creativity and novelty. So they took that to the next level and pushed it in these postmodern designs. So it was very conceptual. They broke away from the traditional grids. They wanted to question the tenets of modernism. So all those modern styles we saw in the early 1900s, they questioned all of that stuff. Like, why does it have to look like this? Why does it have to follow this grid? I don't think it needs to do that. Some examples of that are this magazine done by David Carson, this Ray Gun magazine. There is a ton of overlapping text onto the photos. You can see that there in the Andy Warhol, there's text over his head's cut off. The other magazine, the picture's upside down. So it really kind of pushes the limit. The word ray gun is kind of off the page or cut off a little bit. So they were really pushing the ideas of what could be and couldn't be creative, and really explored some interesting things. Milton Glasser was another famous artist during this period. He created the I Love New York logo and also that Bob Dylan poster that we see there. So his ideas too were very kind of in that psychedelic kind of feel, really reflective on what was going on at the time, conceptual in the idea. And if any of you know, Milton Glasser actually just passed away this summer. So sad day for the graphic design world because he was a very well-known designer. But postmodern design really kind of pushed the limits to a lot of that stuff. And then came the digital revolution in the 80s, right? Late 70s, early 80s. So it removed the specialist nature of graphic design. So originally in graphic design, you had to specialize in something. Like I specialized in page layout, or I specialized in logo design, or I specialized in coloring, or I specialized in photo, whatever it might be. You had your niche and that's what you did. But with the digital revolution, you could easily be all of those roles on the computer. I could design it visually, I can add color to it. I can then add that information into the layout spread, and then I can save this file and prepare it for printing. All of it done by one person. So technology really changed the way design was worked and changed the landscape of who was a designer and the kind of jobs that were there. So Apple, Adobe, and Aldus were kind of the three big people in that generation, in that digital revolution when it came to creativity and stuff. So Apple computers were very much designed for the creative in mind. Adobe started to create software that would lean itself nicely to people in the design world. And then Aldus started that. And some of you maybe never heard of Aldus. And there's a reason for that. They did not do well. Adobe just took over and dominated and ate them up. But they started creating products of page layout and page design to try to compete with this new digital age. In 1984, the first generation of the Macintosh was created, which you see over there to the right. And it was the first one where they used like a bitmap graphics and then also used a mouse. So that was pretty cool. And some of the digital programs that came out, kind of what we just talked about. So the Aldus PageMaker was the first layout program for a personal computer. So that was anything with like when you think of that as Microsoft Publisher, Microsoft Word, those kind of things. Aldus PageMaker was the first one put together. And then we had Quark Express, which was another page layout program that kind of came into it. And then all this started to fade a little bit, and then Quark was there, and Quark held its own for a long time throughout the 90s and competed against Adobe. But then you see Adobe comes in with Photoshop and Illustrator, and then they created their own version of Quark in the form of InDesign, and that just took over. I think one of the things Adobe did really well and had a lot of foresight for was looking at where the design field was going and creating software to meet those needs. So they solved a problem. They saw the problem, they solved it, and they kept it all integrated so that you can move from one thing to the next without having to have a bunch of different programs. You can all do it within one thing. So I think that was one of their big things that made them stick longer than some of these others. They had the ability to add multimedia, animation, instant updating, and access with some interactivity. So that's how software and digital programs were growing. And it was just faster than they could keep up with. And people were just seeing graphic design was taking on this whole new look and feel during this time. So we are going to kind of just stop right there. There's probably a little bit more we can dig into, but we're just going to leave it right there. One thing I will say to kind of wrap this up about the digital age and programs is they just continue to grow. I mean, where we're at now with the Adobe products and what we're creating is beautiful work. And in the early 2000s, people really dug into the digital technology and everything became very kind of flat and it looked futuristic and it looked very digital made. And then right around like 2010, it's about every 10 years kind of design trends and things kind of go through a change a little bit. But we start to see this movement back towards like the middle of the 19th century of like doing things by hand, even going back to the 1920s. Do you remember earlier in like lesson one, we talked about the arts and crafts movement that came around, how they got tired of the printing press and they wanted to go back to bringing back that vintage hand-drawn look and feel to things. That's exactly what we're seeing now in graphic design is this kind of harkening back to the early 1900s, the Art Nouveau movement, the woodblock print, that kind of look and feel. Everything is hand-drawn. It looks like it's chalk. It looks like it's woodcut and printed. It's got some textures to it. It's roughed up. It looks like the early printing methods of screen printing where the ink is maybe offset a little bit. You see a lot of those designs. So even though we're doing digital, we have this desire to want to go back to the craft of creating things. So there's cycles, how trends go through things. You can almost maybe predict what's going to happen in 2020 and beyond in graphic design. If we look at how those trends have gone over the years, who knows what we could be seeing. Maybe kind of a calling back to the pop art movement and the movement of the early 80s, which actually we are seeing that right now, right? Those 80s look and feel is coming back. So maybe we're going to have 90s and early 2000s stuff coming in the next few years. So to wrap this up, what you're going to do is you are going to do a KLM chart. So in a Word document, you are going to answer these three questions. So the first one is, what's one thing you already knew about today's lesson? So after we went through this, something popped in your head like, oh, I knew about that. Like I knew that artist or I knew about that movement. Write that thing down. The second one is, what is one thing you learned from today's lesson? So what's something new you had no idea about? Like, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know that person did that, or I didn't even know that was a thing. That was an art movement. Go ahead and write that down. And then what's one thing you want to know more about from today's lesson? So what's something we covered today that maybe we went through really quickly, or something you're like, that was really interesting and I would love to research a little bit more about that or know more about that? Go ahead and write that down as well. So in Canvas, you'll see that there is an assignment that says KLM chart or KLM chart there. And you're going to open a Word document, write these questions down, answer them, save that Word document, and upload it to that Canvas assignment page. And that's just going to kind of wrap up this graphic design history presentation for this part 3, but we've got a project that we're going to do to kind of wrap up this whole unit. So once you get that done, you can jump down and see the actual project that we'll be creating. So thanks a lot, everyone.